There's more than 6 people. We were predicting how many people would be here. More than 6 is good. The topic is not a hot topic. Philosophical issues concerning Piaget genetic epistemology is not a particularly popular topic, but one worth pursuing. My name is Richard Kitchener. I'll be giving the first paper, followed by Les Smith, and then Ulrich Müller will comment on the 2 papers. Okay? So my paper really is entitled Piaget's Conception of Epistemology. So I'll read some and talk about some. So it's now standard among Piaget scholars to make the important point that Jean Piaget's overall research project was an epistemology, a genetic epistemology, and not simply a psychology. Okay? So people unfortunately continue to misunderstand what his research program was all about, and I think therefore tend to misunderstand him. Okay? He was a psychologist, of course, but he was also a biologist, mathematician, logician, doing all these things, and these terms describe his career, but they don't serve to identify what it was. Okay? So the question really is, what did he mean by genetic, and what did he mean by epistemology? And those questions have really never been pursued very well and in depth. Now, Les Smith has done a wonderful job discussing that, but his message has not really been assimilated by people, so I thought I would take a stab at giving my own take on what that's all about. So, what's the theory of knowledge, the epistemology of Piaget? Right? So, there's 2 types of epistemology or theory of knowledge that go around here, right? And the issue is that there's different definitions of this in different languages. In particular, the English definition of these things are different from continental definitions, right? In particular, French epistemology has a completely different account than, let's call it, English epistemology, okay? So the question is, what were these 2 different accounts of epistemology? So one way of looking at this is to look at some standard encyclopedias or handbooks about epistemology that were prevalent in Piaget's day to see what these were. So the 2 that I picked, the first one was by James Baldwin, entitled Dictionary of Philosophy and Psychology, that was published in 1905. And the second one by a Frenchman, André Lavande, published Vocabulaire technique et critique de la philosophie in 1902 and up to 1926. So these were 2 major encyclopedias, and the contributors were well-known philosophers. So we can take these to be kind of standard accounts of these 2 particular works, okay? In these works, you'll find 2 different accounts of this subject matter that we could call theory of knowledge. So that's a neutral term because you're going to find these 2 definitions get switched historically. So this is very difficult to follow. I apologize, okay? So here's the 2 different senses of, or 2 different parts of theory of knowledge. One is epistemology, and one is philosophy of science, okay? So I use this neutral term for these 2 fields, and the French have comparable terms, epistémologie, theory de la connaissance, but they mean something quite different than English, and we can raise the question of whether Piaget, being French-Swiss, also bought into these, this French conception or not. So the point is, there's was no standard term for the theory of knowledge throughout the history of philosophy until really much later into the 19th century. So there is no term, standard term here. It was first introduced by a Scotsman in the 18th century. We can skip over that, okay? So the fundamental issue is the difference between these two particular accounts. So we can give the following definitions. The English account of epistemology concerns, and I'm sure all of you know this because you've had courses in epistemology, maybe not. The standard definition in English of this field is it concerns the possibility of the sources, the extent, and the kinds of knowledge. This is kind of the standard way of defining epistemology. Okay? The English account of philosophy of science is different. It concerns, here's another standard definition, the concepts, the methods, and assumptions of scientific knowledge. So if you look at those, you'll see those are different kinds of accounts. They're not the same. So for example, in Anglo-Saxon epistemology, they often will be concerned with the question, what is the common sense view of knowledge? What is ordinary knowledge? And not what is scientific knowledge. So that's going to be one of the questions. Now, if you look at those two accounts that are different, the French have a concept of epistemologie, which is the same as philosophy of science. So the French, let's see if I can get this, the next one. Lord, help me, if you will, please. I can. Technologically incompetent as I am, I rely on people smarter than me for the next one. Yeah, next slide. One more. So this is what's happened. So the two accounts have been switched. So in English, we have epistemology and philosophy of science. So the French use epistemologie to refer to philosophy of science, and a different term, something like gnoseology, which refers to the English concept of epistemology. This is very confusing. So in the Greek, you have two concepts or two terms for knowledge, episteme and gnosis, right? So episteme is the sense of really certain knowledge without question. Gnosis is the sense more of a mystical kind of knowledge that you find in the early period of 1st, 2nd century AD, right? So that term is still around, but what we find here is that the French have a very different conception of epistemology, or epistemologie. It's not what English speakers mean by it. And you find that in these two kinds of accounts. Lalande says explicitly, epistemologie is philosophy of science. Now, if that's the case, and Piaget is influenced by Lalande, which he was, and by Baldwin, the question is what he meant by these kinds of things, and did he buy this account? That would be important in knowing what he means by philosophy of science. So the question is, what is the connection between these two fields? Epistemology, philosophy of science. What's the relationship? Now, there's two accounts of this. I'll give you the short version. A popular view says that epistemology, English, is the more general account, and the application results in philosophy of science. So philosophy of science is a subfield of epistemology. I think that view is wrong. Philosophy of science is broader than epistemology because philosophy of science deals with lots of other things. deals with ethics, for example. It deals with aesthetics, it deals with metaphysics. So those aren't the same. Next slide, please. So there's a big controversy over how to understand these two. Okay, so the question is, what did Piaget understand by this, and where do we go to get an account? Now, we could look at his 3-volume work, his magnum opus, published in 1950. But there's a more recent account that he gave that's contained in the work Logique et connaissance scientifique in later 1986, I think. That work is one that I think is interesting for 2 reasons. One, it's his last major work on epistemology. And it's a systematic work. That is, it's comprehensive, it includes a lot. And secondly, and interestingly enough, it's an update of his controversial work, Insights and Illusions of Philosophy, which provoked philosophers all around the world. So it's worthwhile looking at that account to see what he thought, and that's what I'm going to focus on. So there are the chapters in that work written by him. Now there's many other chapters written by other people, but look at all of those that he wrote. Lots of chapters, and they're all on epistemology. Never been translated. I'm working on a translation. No one seems to be interested in an English translation of that. But I'd like to focus on that work, especially chapter 1, that contains a discussion of this, okay? So, let me skip ahead here. Look that work over and ask yourself, isn't that an interesting account? I'd like to pull out all those chapters, translate that, and publish it in English as a major theoretical work. No one's too interested in that, okay? So what we find in that work is the following. There are several discussions of what epistemology is. Ulrich, one more time, please. These are the various definitions or accounts he gives of epistemology. He goes through these and discusses them and talks about what's wrong with each of these. Now, it's not a systematically coherent account that he gives. He tends to write sometimes off the cuff. But here's his discussion of these various accounts. Here's the first one. What is epistemology? Epistemology sub 1 is a particular relation between the knowing subject and the object known. Now that happens to be the definition that Lalande gives of not of philosophy of science, but of gnoseology. So here Piaget is beginning to get into a view of epistemology that one finds in André Lalande's work. Piaget likes this account. He uses it frequently in his work. It's the question of the connection between, if you think of it biologically, organism and environment. In epistemology, it'd be the knower and the object known. So you've got a knower, what he calls the epistemic subject. You've got the object known, the epistemic object. You've got a relation between them, an epistemic relation. And in addition to that, you've got the object and the environment. So the question is, how do all of these relate to each other? So to know an object, to have an epistemic object, the epistemic subject must interpret incoming data and form some conception of that. So the knower is actively involved in processing incoming information by means of various operations resulting in the object known. So you can see there, I think, Piaget's biological basis of his theory of knowledge. And the question is going to be how we understand that and whether we're going to be able to talk about whether the object known is something real or not, or only something cognitive. So that's one view that he entertains frequently. The second account, epistemology sub 2, is the study of the most general conditions of knowledge. He thinks this won't do because he thinks this is not sufficiently sensitive to the fact that different sciences have different ways of knowing, so that's not adequate. A third account, epistemology sub 3, is the study of the conditions of valid knowledge. Now that's getting more to what most epistemologists understand it to be. The crucial question there is going to be what he means by valid, which is a normative concept, and how that's going to fit into his program of genetic epistemology. He argues that you can't understand the notion of norms or validity without understanding the contribution of the subject, because the subject is always interpreting things, and the way the subject interprets things changes over time. So to understand normativity or validity, you have to understand the subject's developmental processes. So that moves him to the fourth account, epistemology sub 4, which is the study of the constitution of valid knowledge. And by that, he means two things. When you study the constitution of valid knowledge, you're studying, first of all, the conditions of acquisition, how the subject acquires, constructs these norms, and literally the constituting conditions of valid knowledge. But again, to do that, you have to look at how the individual is changing over time in this process, which leads to epistemology sub 5, which is study of the passage from states of lesser knowledge to states of more advanced knowledge. Here, the normative dimension is pretty clear, because you're going from lesser to more advanced. For that, you need a criterion or a standard, which is something other than a simple fact, right? So he needs to give us an account of what he means by this and how you defend the notion that this is a normative standard operating to warrant your judgment. This is lesser knowledge and this is more advanced knowledge. And that's going to be difficult because of the standard assumption that in science there are no norms. There's just facts. So if you believe that, there's just facts in science and not norms, studying epistemology scientifically is going to be difficult unless you give some kind of empirically based account of the nature of epistemic norms. And I think he does that, and he can do it, but that's a long and complicated process. So, that account you will find often running throughout Piaget's works, right? You are empirically studying the passage from states of lesser knowledge to states of more advanced knowledge, and always the question is, how do you establish what is better compared to what is worse? So what you find often, in this work also, is he moves from 5 to 6 to epistemology sub 6, which is the study of passage from states of lesser knowledge to states judged to be more advanced knowledge. There you notice the difference. So it seems with the introduction of the word judged, which is obviously a cognitive concept, right? That would seem to get us out of the problem, except a judgment is not, a judgment of something, is a judgment about something being better isn't the same as that thing being better. So he has to somehow be able to show that judging something to be better is going to be empirically based and resulting in the establishment of the norm. So he goes through 2, 3, and 4, accepts 1, goes through 2, 3, and 4, and shows that those lead to 5 and 6. Now, let me stop. And before I go on, and see if you have questions about this very obscure discussion of mine. So, I know this is difficult to follow, and maybe not terribly interesting, but I think this is really what you need to do to spell out his epistemology. So questions about these? Yes?
Yeah, I have several questions. Definition of knowledge.
Of knowledge?
The definition of knowledge is also part of epistemology or not? And erroneous opinions, like Piaget started with erroneous opinions in children. Is that epistemology or not?
Well, it depends.
Then I have other questions. The difference between philosophy and science of knowledge, the Gettier problem, what is justified true belief? Is that scientific or is that philosophic? And then the last point, what does mean empirically based in a constructivist epistemology, like Piagetian? What is the empirical base if all knowledge is constructed?
You have more questions?
Yeah.
Well, let's
The
just
same
start with
question would be also valid to
That
Kant.
should be enough to start us, right? So if you're looking at the epistemic trajectory, children begin with minimal knowledge, many of which beliefs are wrong. And if you follow the passage, they come to know more and more. So that's part of the epistemic passage from states of lesser knowledge to more advanced knowledge. That's part of it, I think, because you want to know what was worse and how it led to something which was better. That would be part of the program. That was one question, so tell me another one. Refresh my memory.
The empirical base in constructivist epistemology.
Well, the empirical base is looking at the individual and what the individual is able to do in terms of their answers to questions you posed, what the individual is able to do in terms of its interaction in the environment. So if you begin with the notion, knowledge is rooted in the individual's interacting in the environment, in the pragmatic results that occur from their behavior, that's the root of knowledge, a kind of sensory knowing how. And then other kinds of knowledge, we would call it knowing that, emerges from that later with the development of conceptual schemes and formal operations. So how does he study these things empirically? You engage in discussions with the child, ask them questions, see what they're able to do, and construct a theory that there is progress occurring in their epistemic abilities. Third question?
The last one you skipped, philosophy and science.
Philosophy and science. What does he think about that? Well, as I'm sure you know, he is one who thinks philosophy is inflated in its pretensions and cannot accomplish what it aims to do, which is to provide you with a different, superior kind of knowledge. That is ruled out. Why? Because philosophy cannot and does not, but more than that, cannot come to objective knowledge, which involves either mathematical reasoning or empirical test. Since philosophy doesn't engage in either one of those, it can't be a legitimate case of knowledge at all, and therefore involves something else, not knowledge, but what he calls wisdom about life, which is not a kind of knowledge at all. So I think that's really a sop to the philosophers. He's really wanting to deflate the pretensions of philosophy that he encounters in his own sphere by arguing essentially philosophy is a non-cognitive endeavor. You can see why philosophers love to hear this kind of thing. So the question of science and philosophy is a difficult one. I think his view is that science, understood a certain way, experimentally, but not interpreted empirically, is able to construct a scientific theory of knowledge, difficult kind of thing to accomplish, but that science can do that, whereas philosophy cannot. So that would certainly get us into a long discussion of this question, heated as it has been in many years discussed by philosophers. Piaget's answer, I think, is philosophy cannot deliver the goods. So we have these different accounts, and the difficult part is going to be, as you mentioned, with showing how you can empirically establish norms. And that's his project, is to show how normative judgments, norms, emerge from lesser states, more factual, less normative states, ultimately the very basis being not norms at all. So it's the emergence of norms from facts, which is going to be extremely difficult to give an account of. Les Smith has written about this considerably, so Les knows all about this. So, what's the epistemological project? The problem, is the question, how is science possible? That's the Kantian question. He thinks that's one of the questions that you can investigate, that Kant investigated and showed certain kind of things involving what are the necessary conditions for knowledge. Kant talked about a transcendental argument showing certain things are necessary. Piaget, I think, is